Oh,
Okay.
is that better?
Oh, that's much better. Yeah.
Yeah, I basically upgraded my operating system, so it might have screwed with the settings. So
Oh yeah. Now we can hear you. So yeah. So the path that so you can see it in Dropbox, but you just can't get Obsidian to open it.
yes, that's the empty vault,
Wow.
and and wait. Yeah, and that's it in Dropbox.
Hmm.
So I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah. I am not sure because it looks that looks similar. Let me just look at. Yeah, it seems like all of the things. I mean, and there haven't been a lot of changes to it since. I mean, most of that stuff I was about 2 weeks ago. I changed. I put things in folders and created this new folder, and looks like people have gotten into it. I am not sure what to tell you to do about that.
I'll try and ask again in the Discord group and see
Okay.
what.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it may have to do with. It sounds like if you've just upgraded your OS, that sounds like the most likely candidate.
Yeah. Yes. Especially as it seems to be messing with my audio as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So there may be some unresolved issues.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. So I have found this this introduction actually probably. I guess I kind of found the introduction more interesting than the first chapter, but there were and I did kind of do my typical thing of kind of going through and highlighting it without really commenting in Kindle, and then kind of bringing a couple of notes across and sticking them. So what do we think about this so far?
I haven't actually started it yet because I had my EMA due last week, so and I've been due this week, and I've just been having a press for the last few days.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes, I've been just kind of slowly decompressing from the semester. It was a sort of a crushing semester. So that was and actually it begins the summer session begins on Monday. So not a lot of vacation time.
Isn't there still ice on out on the lake there when you're starting the summer session?
There is not. We actually did have a little warm blast. So the fishing opener, which happened last weekend, it was on a clear lake, which hasn't always been the case. But usually it's a week earlier. I think they pushed it back a week in Minnesota this year. So it wasn't on Mother's Day. It's usually Mother's Day is the fishing opener, which is kind of ironic. But
well, my first impression, I'm really glad we're taking a slower pace.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice to not feel like I'm sprinting towards something, but can absorb it a little. Mm-hmm. I started out actually listening to the audiobook version, so I'm into the middle of chapter 3 on that.
Right. But as did I. And then I was really happy to see the charts when I finally opened the Kindle.
Yeah. Well, there's I think I don't know if I put it into our vault yet, but there is a link that you can download a PDF and get all the charts, which is nice. And it's on the Harvard's site. Has a resources part that you can get that. Mm-hmm. But the audiobook is, I think, almost even more dull than the reading version, because the person narrating it is just the wrong person to narrate dry economics. So I find it a lot more engaging to actually read the words in this case. But what I find kind of interesting is, in large part, is kind of a massive sea change that's going on in the broader economic space in terms of equality and how we view economics. And I suspect we have, or at least from my reading, I have to pin most of that change to Kahneman and Tversky's work, and how our, I think in a broad sense, we've looked at economics in the same clockwork kind of framing that we have most of the world since the 1700s, let's say. And we now know it's dramatically not. So the common perceptions we've held of economics is this, clear-cut science. Here's the theory, and here's where it goes. Doesn't float anymore, because the theory doesn't actually give us the answers we were expecting all along.
Go ahead. I think that kind of began. I think that there was. There have been other people who have sort of been kind of semi-aligned with this change too, like Stiglitz as well, right? But at some point along the way, the path does seem to kind of diverge, and some of the people who were really kind of closet neoliberals get sorted out as well.
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest, the name I've seen the name donut economics as a framing for how a lot more of this works. So instead of using this tiny core of kind of broken economic model that we've been using since the early 1900s, certainly, is starting to expand into something that's a little more, and I think a lot of it too is coming out of this space of complexity economics, out of the Santa Fe Institute, where they're looking at economics as a much more complex system, or at least acknowledging that it is a much more complex system. But I had been reading Kate Rayworth's book on donut economics, and there are little flashes of things in this that kind of remind me of, we're reframing this broader thesis.
Yeah, I think there's also there have also been. I'm also sort of reminded of who's the guy who wrote Managed by the Markets. Was that Gerald Davis, or is that somebody else? That there's some type of an awareness growing that that there was that sort of neoclassical kind of traditional economics, but then then there seems to have been a kind of a long period of just the water being very muddied. I thought it was interesting that he did, in the introduction, he kind of did a little historiographical description of kind of how historians, more so than economists, have sort of thought about this, and in the notes, which I didn't have a chance to look at until because I listened to it a couple of times while walking, the audiobook, and I didn't find it as bad. Maybe because I was listening. Yes, thanks, Chris. I didn't find it as dull as you did, but I was listening to it at 1.5, so that may have helped. But then kind of coming back to it, and seeing the notes. In the notes, he does cite. He cites Howard Zinn, for crying out loud. But in addition to a bunch of people who, it's always interesting to me, kind of, that he's coming from this French perspective, which is, so like so Fernand Braudel is huge, right? And the Annals are kind of central to this thing, which is not necessarily the way I look at kind of the social history. But this idea that economic and social history also are kind of are sort of in this same box together struck me as kind of a little bit odd, because that's not the way that I think of economic history in the US, right? And he does mention Sven Beckert, right, who did a lot to sort of reorienting our understanding of the Atlantic world around slavery in particular, right? But yeah, this idea of equality increasing also kind of struck me, right? That and it almost a Pinkerist, or a Rosling kind of factfulness. The facts say, that this, this. And at one point he sort of says, there's been long-term movement over the course of history towards more social, economic, and political equality. Then he continues and says, punctuated by multiple phases of regression and identitarian introversion, right? Which almost sounds like he's waving at, Brexit and Trump, right? Identitarian, culture war kind of stuff. And yet, then a couple of paragraphs later, he admits that, it was not muted discussions in Paris salons, but the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue in 1791 that led to the beginning of the end of Atlantic slavery. So that would that not be identitarian introversion? This type of struggle of individuals to, along different axes than this social construction of economic power, right?
Yeah. Or the question is
how he's going to.
The question is who gets to have that identitarian introversion? Who's allowed to?
Right.
Which is a big underlying point of the equality piece. Mm-hmm. Is some people may not have the power to do that the way others might.
Yeah, right. And for whom is it non-trivial? Yeah.
Although I oh, go ahead.
I came to this book after reading Capital, and I was kind of taken aback. What I thought I understood, I'm not an economist, I don't have any background. I was kind of taken from what I thought I understood from Capital, and then reading the beginning of this book, I thought, what? Like you say, he this talks about the general improvement, meaning moving from inequality to equality. And I thought Capital, at least in the time frame it covered, describes moving in the opposite direction. How capital is kind of collected and hoarded and passed on generation to generation as an explanation for a lot of people who think, well, you just work hard and you'll get ahead in this country, perhaps. And actually, you're working against a mighty river flowing against you. in that, if you don't have capital, you're trying to overcome so many obstacles, it becomes almost impossible. So I'm just surprised, and maybe the idea here is to take a much broader or longer term perspective. I don't know where the book is going, but I'm still trying to integrate those ideas.
Yeah, I think it does seem like at first it did strike me as kind of a Pinker-esque thing, right? That yes, we are, especially if you take the whole modern era as a thing, right? And you look at numbers, you could say, well, yes, the population has increased 10x and per capita, but even when he says that, right, per capita income, globally has increased, about 10x from, what do you say, 100 to 1,000 of whatever unit he was talking about, right? euros, I guess, a month. And, you know, but then he immediately admits, right, that this is not, I mean, it's like the, you know, it's like the William Gibson chestnut, right? That the future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed. So, so this global average income did reach approximately 1,000 euros per month per inhabitant at the beginning of the 2020s, but it is scarcely 100 to 200, excuse me, 100 to 200 a month in the poorest countries, whereas it rises to 3,000, 4,000 euros a month in the richest countries. So the global economic system is still very hierarchical and inequitable, he admits, right? So, yeah, so so I'm curious to see where he's gonna take this as well, right? This movement toward equality, right? Because I got the impression as well, as you did, in the, you know, in Capital in the 21st century, that he was saying that, you know, that we had this period, you know, this post World War II period of, you know, kind of opening up and, you know, and a relative kind of flattening of the disparities. And I think that is borne out, you know, and that probably continues in Europe to some extent, where, you know, the difference in, you know, sort of average employee pay versus executive pay is much flatter than it is in America. But
it's become very popular in social media to have charts that show the percentage of wealth held by the top X percent of the population, and that's increasing, which would lead most people, I think, to assume that in terms of equity, we're moving in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it depends on what percent you're talking about, but even the notion that the middle class is kind of fading kind of supports the notion that we're not becoming more equitable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or there's another framing that you can look at too, because I think too often we look at it from a very privileged United States centric space in terms of equality. So the United States saw huge jumps in the middle class in the mid 1900s. In fact, actually, he doesn't mention it, but I remember, I think David Christian quotes it in Maps of Time. He points out that to a great extent, you know, 90+% of the world's population until 1900 existed as subsistence farmers. And the percentage of subsistence farmers on the planet has gone down and is now in the single digits. So just from that perspective alone, the fact that you have to go out and scrape in the earth every day to find your food to be able to eat and sustain yourself, that by itself is a sea change. And
I think people in agriculture would argue that just within agriculture, what's happened is the same thing. The large scale farmer, you know, has much more than ever before, and what you're seeing is the middle hollowing out. I mean, I don't know, you know, personal examples. I grew up in a farming community in Iowa, and only one person at this. Well, I'm in my 70s, but only one person I know out of my college, my classmates, ended up remaining in farming. Everybody else got washed out. Now the guy that remains has a massive operation. And what you don't have, I mean, at least in Iowa, you have these huge farms worth millions now because land is worth $7,000-8,000 an acre.
Yeah.
You don't have subsistence farmers unless they familied into it, because you just can't start. I don't know how anybody can start in agriculture. But I don't see that as a contrary example. But to me, what's happened is the middle has been erased. There's no people with 300 and 400 acre. I mean, very few people with 200 and 300 and 400 acre farms anymore.
Right. Yeah. Demographically, since the 80s, the two growth areas are less than 50 acres and greater than 1,000 acres, and everything in between is decreasing.
You have all the Hmong here in
both in percentage
Minneapolis,
and
south of the city,
numbers.
Growing, farm goods for the farmers markets on maybe an acre or 2 acres, and then you have the people right next to them who own 1,000 acres or more.
Right. And then, I wonder when I see that the numbers about less than 50 acres, if if less than 50 acres includes CAFOs, right? Because you can put, 10,000, birds or, on a 10 acre, plot, in a shed. So yeah, it's definitely different.
It may be telling too, because I was listening to, I think it was Kai Ryssdal on NPR had a little segment on Friday, or maybe Thursday, and he was interviewing a farmer who they apparently frequently go back to. And she didn't mention how many acres she had, but she had what sounded like a reasonably sizable farm, and my guess is probably at least 1,000 to a couple thousand acres. But they were interviewing her because of the squeeze on goods and income, and how the cost of seed and fertilizer and anti-pestilence had doubled or tripled for her. And she said specifically, it's incredibly hard for me because I have to go to the bank and get a loan to cover the cost of all the inputs to be able to do it. So she's farming on the margins. And as someone who's being even interviewed in the popular press on the radio about how this is going, the tough part I think about farming, at least in America, is even if you've got several thousand acres, you're farming on the margins instead of farming out of abundance.
Yeah.
So you don't have the easy access to the inputs that you're not worried about total collapse this year or next year or within 5 years. And I think a lot of that goes back to shifts in agriculture during the Nixon administration, that made it much harder for, the middle guy, the average guy or woman to kind of farm a small spot of land. I didn't know personally until I was in my late teens that my grandmother owned several thousands of acres of farmland in Illinois and Iowa. I had no idea. I knew my parents always said, yes, she grew up on a farm, but I had no idea she personally owned several thousands of acres of farmland. And then when she died, she had 7 kids who inherited it, none of whom were in farming. I don't think any of them even had a personal garden in their backyard the way she did, which was how I knew her, as like, oh yeah, she's a farmer. She has this, larger than average suburban backyard mini farm.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, she's got somebody farming several thousands of acres of plants for her. I had no idea. So she died, and the estate, they decided we're going to sell this. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, no, let's not do that. You got enough space and enough acres. You actually could turn this into a business for one or more of the kids or grandkids who, honestly, some of them needed it. But everybody said, no, we're going to sell it, and we're going to cash out for the cash. Mm-hmm. And nobody took that. But it's because there was no continuity of let's keep farming, or I know there's cases pending in the South where bankers actively did not give credit to African American farmers, and as a result, we went from hundreds of thousands of African American farmers down to several dozens in the span of 2 or 3 decades because of systematic racism that kept them from getting loans to be able to continue those farms. So eventually they all got squeezed out, and then big ag comes in and buys up all the land.
Mhm.
And that, but it speaks, I think, to a question of how stable and resilient are our systems, or when we come to things like with the Ever Given, gets stuck in the middle of a channel, in a shipping channel, with hundreds of boats stacking up behind it for a week, and it costs multiple billions and causes issues with our just-in-time supply chains. How do we deal with that? Is our system resilient enough to deal with quick shocks to the system?
It does seem like we're increasing the number of single points of failure possibilities. And even, it's kind of funny, even when I read or listen to, people like Joel Salatin, right, talking from, the alternative side of agriculture, right? It always struck me, I always thought, well, it's a really hopeful, kind of positive thing. And yet Salatin has, 500 acres in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. Not everybody can replicate that. And so, so it's sort of that same thing. And in more traditional, what's now traditional animal agriculture, right, where you're you're growing broiler chickens, right? You're a contractor for Tyson, right? And Tyson tells you how many chicks they're going to send you. And, or if you're working, if you're in the turkey business in Minnesota, working for Genio, they tell you how many poults they're going to send you. And, but only if you meet all of the criteria, only if you build the shelters to their plans and, and do all of this stuff. So there's all of this sort of capital risk and a very, in a single market to sell back to. So yeah, you're in a very, very kind of difficult, tough spot. So there do seem to be some, and I guess this would, looking at the chapter, the first chapter that we were reading, that does strike me as, sort of that kind of social, this kind of structural power relationship that's going on, that I'm hoping he's going to talk about. He doesn't, and I'm a little bit concerned, honestly, because, in the first chapter, when he's talking about this movement toward equality, he says that this, he does say that this is a battle whose outcome is uncertain, right? And it's a fragile social and political process that's always ongoing and always in question, right? So it's not a battle that we win, it's a battle that we continue to fight. And then he talks about life expectancy and these measurements, right? These factfulness kind of measurements where, you go from a life expectancy of 32 in 1820 to 73 in 2020, literacy from 10% to 85%, which is all good. And then he kind of vaguely mentions, once again, that it's unequal, it's uneven, right? That it's not the same in the global South as it is in the global North. He doesn't mention along the way that a lot of that increase in prosperity in the global North came at the expense, was basically financed by the global South. Everything from, the mines of Potosi to, to sugar plantations to everything else.
How much of equality is defined in terms of overall advancements as opposed to internal variability? So you mentioned, age, longevity. When the average longevity was 35, what was the variability?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a different way to frame the issue of equality. If a lot of people never made it out of infancy, and the wealthy could overcome that issue and live to 60, that's one way to get to 35.
Right.
But that's, so part of this is definitional, right?
Yeah, and I think part of it is those tricky gotchas, or where if you would if you make it past the age of 1, and he does mention that briefly, or if you make it past the age of 5, right, then things are quite different. So infant mortality, childhood death, I think is a huge, it's kind of below the surface, but ought to be kind of examined, because it does seem like, once you've gotten past, or if you're from if you're born into a wealthy family in 1820, you have a much greater likelihood of surviving your first year or your first 5 years, and then you're gonna make it to 80. There's a moment at the end of the first chapter where he sort of criticizes these human development index, global progress indicator things that he thinks kind of tend to muddy the waters, and that sort of struck me as interesting. It's like, well, he first says, well, GDP doesn't capture everything, but then he kind of comes back around and says, let's continue to use these discrete measures and use a lot of them, and maybe play one off against the other, rather than trying to do these things that, I guess his argument is, they sort of decrease transparency. Is that it?
Just in statistical terms, though, that's why we have more than usually calculating just the mean. Mm-hmm. Mean doesn't necessarily tell you about the variability.
Right. Yeah.
And particularly when he's talking about diversity between, global North and South, mm-hmm. I always think of it as a much more dramatically different picture. So I'd rather see a whole spread of the curve and where everybody sits on that, rather than, because even if you give me the mean and the median, that gives me a little information, but I'd rather see the whole curve to know exactly what's going on. And I think that gets missed in a lot of kind of popular press books. Mm. And that's the tough thing too, is he's got a platform here to do a little more broad popular cultural appeal. But I think because he's publishing this through Harvard and Belknap Press, he's writing more for his colleagues than he is for us, the us that he's got, because there's going to be, I think a lot more people bought Capital than actually read it.
Sure.
And probably after, Stephen Hawking's book, this is probably the most bought and least read book that's out there. But he's got, I think where he's going, at least with this, it's not as dense in terms of the content. Mm-hmm. And I think he's painting an incredibly rosy picture in a time when I don't view the world as rosy as he does. Mm-hmm. Certainly. In fact, this is probably one of the least rosy time periods in my lifetime.
Yeah. And I wonder about that, because I also wonder about this, and I guess I still haven't decided how I feel about this whole sort of, this whole pinkerism thing, right? That, that things are sort of objectively better than they were. And, and is that even meaningful, right? I do think that, and also, I mean, there's this assumption that 2/3 of the sample is going to be between the, the mean and the, and the first standard deviation on either side, right? Is that legit? Are we just going to assume that? What about long tails, right? And I'd like to see that. Another thing, kind of going back to what you were talking about with respect to kind of the way economics has changed, Chris. It seems like after Ilya Prigozhin and after, kind of chaos theory, right? And all of that. And who's the Marxist who picked that up? Alf Hornborg, right? Really grabbed onto Prigozhin and sort of did this sort of new take on Marxism by way of thermodynamics and chaos theory, which is super complicated, and I'm not sure how I feel, I'm not sure if I completely understand that and how I feel about it, except that I found it very, very interesting that he was trying to use these systems. And again, I'm not 100% sure whether they're metaphors or they're actual applications of this theory to data. But it does seem like there needs to be. Isn't Pinker on is he still at Harvard?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
I think he is.
So maybe he's in a little writing group, with Pinker, and these people are talking to each other and trying to figure out how to.
Well, you've coined this morning, and I don't know if you've seen it before. Maybe the word Pinkerism as describing. So there's his example on violence recently. And then this example within economics where, someone, and correct me if I'm wrong in interpreting what you're saying, but somebody shows up with a huge amount of data indicating that we're moving in a particular direction through a broad swath of history. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious what other examples of this kind of Pinkerist movement there are besides Pinker himself and possibly Piketty here.
Harari.
Yeah.
Although
I don't know if he came at it with the volume of data that.
I think. I think Anand Giridharadas said they were, and I think he might have been quoting someone else, said that they were pinkering. They were using the long run direction of human history to minimize and to delegitimize the concerns of those without power. And I think he's quoting a guy named Giussani.
And who is the name? Who is the name of the quote?
Giussani, Giussani. There was economic pinkering, which is to tell the people the global economy has been great because 500 million Chinese have gone from poverty to the middle class. And of course that's true, Giussani said. But if you tell that to the guy who has been fired from the factory in Manchester because his job is taken to China, he may have a different reaction. But we don't care about the guy in Manchester. So there are many facets to this kind of ideology that have been used to justify this kind of situation. And then he also quotes Jonathan Haidt. Who's I think I'm also simultaneously listening to a Jonathan Haidt audiobook because my dad is interested in him. I think my dad is sort of interested in Haidt as a way of the righteous mind, why good people are divided on politics and religion, and Peter Watson, these people who are sort of hanging on to kind of the Western canon, right, and the Enlightenment, kind of capital E. In the narrow formulation that that Pinker and Harari think of it in, which again I think kind of oddly is not entirely untrue, but is ignores a huge part of the story.
The problem too that I see with these arguments of all this data that say, hey, we're going in a direction, in some sense that tells a more teleological endpoint, which may or may not be there.
Mhm.
And, essentially since Aristotle, we've had this overarching storytelling, we're going somewhere and here's where there is,
Yeah.
with really no evidence. And most of, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution has been teaching a different story of there isn't an end goal in sight. There just is. It's, like Prigozhin, it's statistical thermodynamics and we're somewhere on a spectrum. But what they're not providing in these massive groups of data is, yes, we're moving in a direction, but no one's presenting evidence to say we're not out on the very tip of a very flimsy tree branch that's just going to collapse on us and we're going to fall into the middle of nothing. What's the support holding the whole enterprise up?
Mhm.
And a lot of the time that evidence does not exist to say, hey, we couldn't collapse at any moment.
Well, there was kind of a Malthusian moment there too that he did mention.
Or we have, you go back to that, or you have right now a massive pestilence and, a fairly large multi-country war afoot, which makes it all the more reason you need to say, hey, how do we prop this up with something besides little hints that Putin is getting, medical treatment for something and, what happens.
Well, part of the issue, though, in the long-term view, is how many variables you include. If when you see progress within a closed system that requires the utilization of resources that may not be replenishable,
Right.
You're going to reach a point at which you continue to use these resources where, that's, one view of where we're at historically is that we're approaching a point that has to go the opposite direction because we've used up all the resources that allow for growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does seem like that has been, that he did one, I think I noticed one use of the word externality in this first chapter. Right. So it does, and it does seem like he is aware of sustainability as being a huge issue and something that he's going to have to address sometime in this book, which I don't remember that being present in Capital in the 21st Century. So maybe this is an improvement.
Yeah, I think when he used the word externality is when I wrote in the margin donut economics. Yeah. Or at least here's a hint that he's giving a nod to there being a larger experiment going on in a much larger box than the traditional, economic view of things.
Yeah. I think the thing I hope that he will deal with externality intelligently, right? Because I don't see that a lot. Even in economists who acknowledge externalities, in my mind there are different forms of externality, right? There's the externality of just we're choosing not to include this in our economic calculation because there are different reasons, right? One of them is maybe it's something that is not typically quantified, right, and not typically discussed in terms of an economic value, right? So quality of life, aesthetics, things like that. Those have always, those are typically the ones that. Oh yeah, definitely. We'll I think that's a good idea to kind of put together a list of the things that we're kind of referring to. But so there's this so economists generally deal with that, right? That there's something happening that is difficult to quantify, right? So environmental quality, or whatever, or aesthetics, or the sound of the jet landing over your house every 15 minutes. But the other one, or the other ones, right, the situation where it's external because the other reasons it might be hard to quantify are that it doesn't happen till way later, right? That's the global warming externality, right? Or it doesn't happen, or it is it's a centralization and a privatization of the profits immediately at the center, and a wide distribution. Everybody takes a little hit so it's a kind of a privatizing the gains and publicly subsidizing the externality, the losses, right? So there's a whole lot of different ways, I think, that these things that should be considered can be ignored, I guess. The thing that jumped out at me hugely was on page 14 in my ebook. He talks about the Soviet Union, and he calls it this major event that runs through and to a certain extent defines the 20th century. And it was like my head exploded. That was like, that is the coolest description of the Soviet Union in the 20th century that I've seen, that making a major contribution to the victory over Nazism, and I hadn't really thought of, I've thought a lot about the Cold War as a thing that caused bad stuff to happen in the United States, right? Like McCarthyism and that sort of thing, this reaction, this nationalist reaction. I hadn't really thought about it as openly, I guess, as I'm now thinking I should have, as a thing that actually helped to push us to the left in terms in issues like civil rights and Social Security and the New Deal and all of that stuff. So I'm gonna.
Well, I'm curious. I'm curious if the U.S. reaction to the Soviet Union in things like McCarthyism and kind of moving things to the left socially and politically, if it was was it the far right who saw where that leads us, and the knee-jerk reaction the U.S. took to a large part of it in the second half of the 20th century was to prevent some of that. Because even now in political discourse, I don't even feel like I can call it the far right anymore. It's just the right, and it's a massive monolith because they've squeezed even the conservative centrist liberals out of the political discourse. But they talk about communism, and I hear the words commie pinko now thrown at people like AOC, yeah. And it's like, so there's still that fringe, one edge screaming at the far other edge. And I find that interesting that that's still a thing in political discourse, when I think more of America than we realize is bunched up into that center. 2/3 of us are within a standard deviation. Mm-hmm. Just nobody's talking about it or has a way to visualize it. And I think the UK may be in a little bit of that same space, but it's that phrase too within the broader spectrum of Russian history. If you go back, 500, 600, 700 years, Russia seems to, on an almost 75-year cycle, go from one extreme to the other and flip-flops back and forth. And it looks and appears as if it's doing it yet again with what Putin's doing, although he's accelerated the timeline and he's doing it on a 25 or 50-year scale rather than the 75 to 100-year scale that has played out in Russia for the last 600 or 700 years, I think.
Mm. Well, it could be. I mean, you could think of it as 100-year-ish kind of thing. If we, if you connect what Putin's doing now with, the second decade of, the Soviet consolidation.
There was an interesting point that he said Russia is moving in this direction towards more equality. And then, what happens if you get, and I think the United States was very lucky in having someone like a George Washington who kind of set the tone and said, here's where we're going, here's the model. And then we've roughly followed it. Yeah. But what would have happened in that time period had America had someone like a Donald Trump come in and say, I'm going to have a whole different paradigm, and what does it look like? So where did the Soviet Union go wrong in their first several leaders in the beginning of that leadership, going from Bolshevism into Stalinism? It's like, we're moving this way, but we're going to quietly make a turn in the total opposite direction, or move in a perpendicular.
Well, there was at least a second party, right? There was the anti-federalists that became the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, and they did, Jefferson did call it the Revolution of 1800. So I think that's, I think that's a very interesting, kind of moment there where, first, morning.
Hey, aloha.
Hi. So first, Washington steps away, right? But then Adams kind of doubles down on federalism, and then go ahead, John.
Oh, are you finished with that point?
I think I am.
I wanted to go back to page 14 that you mentioned, without the pressure of the Soviet Union, that it made more possible the acceptance of Social Security. What are the connections there? I mean, I didn't really understand that, and I need a historian to explain that.
Well, I think that is, I found that really interesting. That there is a lot of resistance, right, in the first couple years of the Great Depression. Hoover insists that everything's fine, and and we're going to bounce back and all of that, and then and apparently, and historians haven't done a great job of telling this story, I think, but I think what we're beginning to think, and the consensus is beginning to form, that the Franklin Roosevelt of the beginning of the campaign and the Franklin Roosevelt who's inaugurated are, that there actually is some significant change there, right? That he basically, gets involved in this feedback loop where he takes on a lot of, this idea that there's going to be a New Deal for America kind of is not what he thinks he wants to do when he decides to run, but ultimately, he finds that this is what Americans, he goes on these whistle stop, he basically, his entire campaign is basically whistle stop speeches, right? Because he can't really get around, and he's hiding that fact. And but the reaction that he gets sort of leads him to this thing, and of course he does surround himself with a bunch of of people who are sort of still progressives, right? So there is kind of and it is a bit of a kind of a top down elite progressivism, which is kind of the way I always think of progressivism. But I think there's a response, the people who had been progressives are responding, also based on the first Red Scare, And and based on this idea that we have already sort of America has positioned itself as not a friend to the Bolsheviks, even before we know about Stalin, right? And so I think that the existence of the Soviet Union, and you got to also remember that that during the first 5-year plan, once Stalin gets in, in the late 20s and institutes the first 5-year plan, it seems to be going really well, right? So so America and Western Europe are kind of crushed by this Great Depression, and as far as anyone knows, the USSR is doing great, right? Because Stalin's lying. And so, so there seems to, so I think there's a lot of pressure in America to, to look to that, right? The Reds, are gaining, right? This is this period where the Reds are, haven't become disillusioned, with Stalin because they don't know about Stalinism yet. So I think there's a lot of pressure. And it's unclear, what type of strong central government there's going to be, how do you do that without being fascist? And I mean, and it's really difficult for us, with the hindsight of the Second World War to, to kind of think about fascism and, and in what ways is the great, is the Roosevelt's first administration, his first 4 years, not fascism. So I think there are a lot of things that are sort of left, sort of unresolved because then we had the Second World War. We know what happened, and we know what fascism was, and so we can't use those words, and we know what Stalinism became, and so we can't really think about it in those terms either. Pat, you're saying French martial arts. Yeah, I think there is a sense that, and also there's also the bonus marches, right? So so you get all of these guys who who are World War veterans, right? Who go to Washington to just ask that their bonuses be paid early, right? And Hoover sicks the army on them, right? And people get killed, and MacArthur, leads, tanks against these veterans. And so I think there's a moment where I think there's a sense that things could get out of hand. And so that creates a space where this can happen. Yeah, and then the Supreme Court, locks FDR until he threatens to pack the door, which is not the first time that's happened, right? The Supreme Court, I think, begins as 6 people, right, in the early republic. Yeah, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see when some time goes by what we think of the things that have happened in the last couple of years. There's, there are people who are trying to kind of say that wasn't such a big deal, or say that it was, it was the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. I think both of those are probably kind of inaccurate. But it will be interesting to see, and I guess it'll probably, depending on what happens in the midterms and the 24 presidential election, that will give us more of a lens to view that through. And maybe make it impossible to see it clearly.
It takes us, but it'll take us back to the book. But it will shift gears slightly. But I'm curious if anyone else noticed the note-taking sentence that he throws into the beginning of the book. There was a very specific. It was in the main text of the book, and it's a kind of a side thing. But I was curious because of what this group is and where we've been, if anybody had noticed it.
Where is it?
And having given people a second to think about it. So in the introduction, it's on my page 7, but he says, between 1930 and 1980, Labrousse, Dumard, and Kuznets carried out their research almost exclusively by hand on file cards.
Yeah, I saw that.
So I was like, oh my God, So here's 3 more people, 3 economists who, ostensibly were, and they may not have been. Most of the examples I find, typically from the early 1900s, don't tend to follow the more German Zettelkasten style of note taking, and it generally happens to be people they're using a commonplace book setup, but they're using index cards to do it rather than notebooks or books. But I saw that and I was like, oh, this is going to spark a 20-minute discussion. But I didn't know if anybody else had noticed it, because he says, index file cards.
Yeah, then the switch to technology as a way to advance, right?
But it's, I can only imagine the amount of heavy data crunching they're doing and trying to do that all on index cards 100 years ago versus almost 100 years ago versus doing it with computer tools now at a larger scale.
Oh, yes, I see, because he goes on to say that this was so difficult that it left them little energy for the work of historical interpretation, mobilization of other resources, and critical analysis. That's it. That is an interesting perspective, that it's so much work just crunching the numbers that you've used all your resources, that you have, that you're like ego depleted and you can't think about it anymore.
Well, and it also kind of points out the fact of the stories we tell ourselves. So when the uber elite of the, in early 1900s intelligentsia in the US and France and, the West essentially is having that much trouble crunching actual numbers and data to figure out what is the picture of where we're actually at, or where have we just come from, even, much less where are we at. Then the stories you're telling of where you're at are total guesses based on the cultural stories and the journalism and the mass media of the time versus, hey, we have a much better, I think one of the most interesting parts about his book, his prior big book, is here's a massive amount of data that I've spent roughly a decade or more, not only collecting and using my own data, but meta collecting others' data to give this better indicator. And is it a complete picture? Maybe not. Maybe there's data missing. There's holes and pieces of what we have available, and what can we recreate justifiably. But how can we know where we're at unless we can actually kind of take the picture and paint the picture with actual data, instead of saying, in broad brushstrokes, oh, here's where, some politician says, here's where I think we're at.
Right.
And that is heavily underlined in a presidency like Trump's, where Trump will show up to crowds and say, here's where we're at. But he has no data or even basic raw fact to indicate that, yes, that's the case. It's, and then you have one group of people moving in one direction based on no facts. In fact, that's it's another one of Pinker, another kind of mini Pinkerism. Is one of his last books was about rationality.
Yeah.
Are we post-rational society now, or are we still rational? And what do we base that on?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this period from 1930 to 1980 is also, this is also the period, especially the post-war to 1980, right, is the period of the annals and then the new social history, right? And so this idea that we were going to eschew anecdote, right, and actually try to deal with data, right? And we were going to actually, try to use this data to hear the voices of those people who didn't leave, archival records and didn't write down their stories in a way that we could, find elite stories in, letters and archives and political documents and things like that. So yeah, so there's that whole, that's all happening in these decades, right? Is that we're thinking that we're more focused on those things, but yeah, but are we really, right? Does that, and then the Club of Rome, right, in 1970, 70-ish, 70, 71, right, kind of comes out with their limits to growth, right? And unlike the population bomb, right, unlike the guy who came before in the late 60s, was that Ehrlich, who was basically just making stuff up, they purport to be using computers, right? And they've got this model, this model that they're using that has 6 variables, and they're turning the dials and they're creating these scenarios, all of which you could do on your phone now, of course. But at the time we were so impressed.
Yeah. I'm struck by, I remember Alan Greenspan's, his autobiographies, looking back on his life, and he actually talks about going in and getting actuarial tables and raw data to kind of build early models as he's coming up in his economic career. And he underlines how painful and effortful that was.
Yeah.
And then you compare that with, I'm coming back from school with my daughter yesterday, and we started talking about Netflix and problems Netflix is having. And so she's curious. So she pulls out my phone while we're driving home, and she starts quoting statistics and kind of rebuilding 20 years of Netflix data in her head.
Yeah.
With what is available on my phone to, and I'm like, you should totally, I came home and gave her an accounting textbook, and I said, you can recreate and figure out where Netflix is going based on all these numbers we were talking about on the way home. Is it good? Is it bad? And, you couldn't have done that even 20 years ago easily. Right. We're at the point where I want to say it maybe was an episode of Showtime's Billions, where the traders are actually able to look at data of electricity usage in a city and realize that the power consumption for a city in China has gone down. And they use that as a reason to bet against a company, because they're not actually putting out what they say they're putting out. And they know that at the next quarter, the returns for the company are going to be horrible. So we should bet heavily against them because we have this super uber targeted bit of data that we can leverage, and you couldn't even do that at a national scale,
right,
20 years ago.
Right. No, the first time I used SPSS was on a stack of cards, right, in 1982 or 1983. It was on a stack of cards that I punched out on a Honeywell teletype, and then I handed it through the window to the operator, right, and they ran it, and it all all it amounted to me, all of that work amounted to was a single least squares curve fit, right? So that was the most you could hope for. So what, yeah, so the types of questions that you could ask were completely different based on that capability.
Well, I still have yet to see someone with a laptop computer at the horse track as a means of like gambling.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're doing it all in the morning. I know gamblers who spend all morning until post time handicapping so that they can read the odds the minute before post and then place their bets.
Right. See if the odds that are posted conform to their assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's and there's even a word for it. It's called the underlay or overlay. So you're looking for you handicap things, and then based on your assessment, did the crowd vote the other way? Right. And if they do to a big enough extent, then that's when you place your bet.
That's a space.
And you only bet on those overlays, and that's where you make your money back. Because you're also most tracks, at least in the US, there's almost a 27% tax on the first dollar you spend at the window. So before you even placed your bet, you've already lost 27% of what you're putting down on the table.
Wow.
So you have to be able to overcome that hill first,
right?
Much less, make big money at the other end.
Yeah. Not unlike what Taleb says in Anti-Fragile.
Yeah. Or are we all just the Thanksgiving turkey on, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving?
Right. These people love me. Yeah. So Pat, you're saying that he's going dark in the next couple of chapters. So all he's doing is
right.
He's setting up a straw man that he's going to knock down.
Well, he just admits that there has been major progress, particularly over the last 2 centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And but that doesn't mean he's not going to delve into the increasing inequality that we're seeing, particularly in the United States, and where that may lead and what to do about it.
Okay. Well, I did think that it was on my page 9. I did think that it was hopeful that he does mention, the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, and then he goes on to talk about the financial crisis in 2008 and the pandemic. So maybe that is going to give him overturning the various certainties that shortly before had been considered irrefutable. The level of public debt and the role of central banks.
That's a key point, that the existing, before what he's writing, state of the economics is this belief in the great magic hand,
right?
And that if you just focus on GNP, everything will be fine for everybody, all boats will rise. But what he says is not true. That some people can't even launch their boats because of the circumstances they're born in. Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, not only some people, but maybe at least 50% of the people, maybe more, in the ways that things are now changing.
Well, that's good. That's good. And when he's talking about power relationships, he does say the idea that there's a spontaneous consensus regarding equitable and emancipatory institutions, and that breaking elites' resistance would be sufficient to put these institutions in place is a dangerous illusion. So yeah, maybe he is going to embrace complexity, which would be good.
Well, the magic bullet I'd love to see is, if we're moving in a particular direction, and what are those events that cause us to keep moving in that direction, either subtly or in large jumps. Yeah. How can we in the future continue to do those types of things as a culture and a society, and do it in a larger swath to try and get us where this teleological goal we're supposedly moving towards.
Right. Right. I think I do recall that he is, I think I recall hearing that he is going to argue for actual post-colonial reparations. And and he's going to make a big point about the difference between regressive and progressive taxation. And so, so maybe those are going to be a kind of part of his solution set.
Well, he delves into historical slavery extensively in a couple of chapters, to the extent that I think his book would probably be banned in Texas and Florida.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that he's coming. I mean, if I have my timeline right, I don't have it. Oh, it's in my office at work. Capital in the 21st Century kind of came out right on the heels of Occupy, right? And so now we've got, this next thing. Maybe, now we've got, the response to the pandemic. So maybe that will that'll kind of create something that he can talk about. It does. I mean, it would be interesting to see if he deals with, or if as we're kind of dealing with him, we sort of respond to kind of culture war and and wokeness and all of that, because I do think that there's an element of kind of, at least where I live in academia, of this idea, this kind of declensionist idea that it is bad, right? And that there are not, very, very many positive things we can say, and that pinkerism is a problem, right? This, the idea that, that the way that other, that Jirdadas described Giussani, right? That these people are kind of coming down on this, sort of Panglossian rosy optimism.
Yeah, I'm always struck every week, Dan, when we see you on camera, that the walls behind you aren't shinier and more ivory colored the way I always would have imagined them to be.
Well, it's
more of like a light, beige-ish kind of.
It's weird. I'm about to, the course that I'm going to begin teaching on Monday is an introduction to equity, which is part of this equity certificate that I've designed. And I'm trying, and we're in northern Minnesota and everyone up here is white, which is not entirely true, right? We're Bemidji is actually situated between the three biggest reservations in Minnesota. So we do have, the cats are, oh, were the cats going crazy? They were sleeping there for a while. But I want to sort of acknowledge that, although my students are kind of going to be coming to me because they want to learn about equity, that they're coming out of a very kind of polarized environment, right? Where they're, so I'm going to try to address, some of those kind of social justice warrior tropes.
So I see in your email you have a certificate mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious about that. I'm an academic or ex-academic. I'm retired. Who takes that?
Well, it's brand new. It's a 15 credit undergraduate certificate. So what we're going to do is we're going to have two courses on either end, an intro to equity and then a capstone course, which we're going to call applications of equity. And then in between, there'll be 9 credits, which will be 3 more courses that actually come from a list of about 4 dozen courses in a bunch of different disciplines that they can, that they'd be taking anyway, probably. And then they can basically reflect on those and do a kind of a portfolio thing where they think about, what they learned about equity in, Indigenous studies or in, the psychology of disability and ableism, sure, or, whatever. then the certificate hopefully will apply to a bunch of different. There'll be a bunch of different tracks. As I said, it's brand new. We're launching it really kind of in the fall, but I'm teaching the intro course as an experimental course this summer.
Mhm.
So the idea is that someone who, for example, is, training to be a high school social studies teacher, right, could do an indigenous equity track or an anti-racism track, right, or any number of different things, an ableism, disability thing, or somebody in nursing, or so it's not necessarily that that somebody in a particular program is going to do the equity track of their program, but that they're going to do something adjacent, right, and bring that kind of additional credential into their portfolio or their resume or CV or whatever. So I mean, it's brand new, and it's the first one in our state system. So hopefully it will, develop some traction and get some interest throughout the state.
Has anyone thrown the epithet critical race theory at you for that yet?
Only in a hopeful way. Not yet in a negative way. And I'm sure and I do want to kind of sort of do a preemptive first strike on some of those ideas of, kind of CRT and wokeness and anti-racism and actually, while we were developing it, some people said, well, why, you've got, diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism plus, right? Why are you focusing on, just equity? And really it was because that's the thing that interested me the most. Right, because I'm a historian, right? So I'm more focused on, sort of social justice, the lack of social justice, struggles for social justice, and that's what I want. That's what I felt like I could contribute. So other people, I am going to try to make it experiential and make it, not just about things that happened a long time ago. So I don't know. It's
or even and I think about it too, because I grew up in an area of the American South that was heavily influenced by John C. Calhoun's gold interests and pushing the Indians out in rural North Georgia.
Yeah.
But I remember a few years ago there was a good series. I want to say it was like 14 or 15 episodes that John Biewen did called Seeing White. And I remember somewhere in the middle or to the early part around episode 5, he actually had a story he did, because I think he grew up in Minnesota or was in the area and had no education about it. But he did an episode on what Lincoln's treatment of the local Indians in Minnesota was in the mid to late 1800s.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It was, he was like, it was a total shock to me. And I completely felt I could commiserate with him, because having grown up literally 5 minutes from the Cherokee Nation capital in the United States, we had zero education about literally what happened in our backyard.
Right.
That is now conveniently a large golf course.
Chota is?
Yeah, wow. Literally across the street from New Chota is a massive golf course.
Wow.
And it just says so much about who we are as a nation.
Yeah. It's funny. There's in Mankato, where I actually got a master's in history. Most of the people of Mankato don't know that the concrete bison under the highway overpass that you can see from the the window of the children's section of the public library is what they call Reconciliation Square. And that's actually the site of the largest public execution in American history after the Dakota War in 1862, when 303 people were sentenced to death, and Lincoln commuted the sentences of all but 38, but it was still the biggest. It was still the biggest execution in American history, and yeah, most of the townspeople, I don't know, maybe they do know now, but when I lived there in 2006 or 2007, weren't a lot of people who were aware of it. I think since then I went there, took my son down to Mankato State to see it a few weeks ago, and they put a new monument next to the concrete bison, and it's actually like a scroll with all the names of the people who were executed. So, maybe there's more awareness now. But yeah, it'll be interesting kind of to see sort of where this goes and how much. I'm just actually looking. I'm sort of scrolling forward and looking at the chapter heads in Kindle now, and the great redistribution looks promising, and then because I think that's a thing that sort of fascinates people, and that it would be good to for the general public to read about how this thing happened with the middle class. I mean, it's almost like a Thomas Frank thing, right? Like what the heck happened? We had this middle class, and oh, thanks, Chris. There was this kind of wide, widening of opportunity, at least for some people in post World War II America, and probably in Europe as well. But again, how much of that, I mean, when you think about Europe, how much of that is, $13 billion spent, in the Marshall Plan. Right. So, yeah, so it's still complicated. It'll be interesting to see where this goes and how much it opens up to. I do feel a little bit, I do feel that in spite of, I don't feel completely bad that he's saying, human progress exists, because then he immediately qualifies it, right, in that first paragraph of chapter 1, right? But it's a battle, right, and it's an ongoing battle. So, so maybe that's hopeful. Anyways, we are kind of out of time. So, any last words? Any last thoughts? Ellerman, you kind of came a little bit late to the party here.
Yes, I did. I'm sorry. I guess I didn't realize, especially because of the time difference. So, what time do you folks convene on Saturdays?
Well, it's 10 o'clock for me, but we're doing daylight savings now, so it's UTC -5. It used to be -6, so that may have been part of the complication.
And it's
Okay, -5.
And it's 4 p.m. here in the UK.
Yep.
Okay. No, that answers it for me. Thank you.
You bet. So, next week we will talk about the slow deconcentration of power and property, and then again over 2 centuries, right? So that'll be interesting. And one of the things that I wonder about, talking about basing the repairing of Ukraine on the Marshall Plan. Well, apparently the U.S. has a lot of money to spend. Apparently we don't have any infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. Yeah, it'll be. But in any case, it'll interest me in this conversation whether some of the things that I think economists like to measure don't seem to me to be maybe as central as they want them to be. Home ownership, for example, is a big, I see this chart on page 38, right, with real estate net of debt. that was one thing that did sort of occur to me was, well, what about this whole, sort of the new world order, and you will own nothing and be happy. What does it mean when you have, home ownership, when you're actually, heavily mortgaged and the bank actually owns your property.
Yeah. What do you really own? Or,
what do you own? Yeah.
Or I like comparing it to some of the stuff I'm reading on indigenous cultures and different life ways. And, I always think, okay, if the world is going to end, I think I'm going to move and live with the indigenous peoples in Australia who still remember how to do that.
Yeah.
Because when the rest of society has collapsed, where are you going to go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was not the entire motivation for moving to northern Minnesota, but I've raised sheep and chickens now, and I know how to do it. So
yeah,
it's.
Let us know when you got the cat thing under control.
Oh, the cats are in control. Actually, that's the thing. It's sort of like that question of does owning things confer equal power on people? The cats own nothing, but they're the bosses.
Or to take it back to our agriculture conversation earlier, are we raising corn, or is corn raising us?
Yeah.
I like the old Super Bowl commercial of the herding cats.
Yeah. They're I think they pretty much have the life. All we need to do is find some species that will take care of us in that way, right? Maybe that is is what's going to happen after the what do they call it, when the computers take over, the singularity.
No. It's when it all collapses and then we turn into Wells's Enoch and or the Morlock and the Eloi.
Yeah.
Who's raising who?
Right.
Or the Planet of the Apes.
Yeah. Yeah. Or it's weird. It's sort of I think it will be interesting to kind of look at this through this book through the lens of, what are we really concerned about, and is it inevitably, is there an inevitable and necessary connection between economic inequality and social power? So we used to have a story about democracy in America, right?
Oh, I don't know. I gotta head out, so I'll see all of you cis white guys next Saturday when we talk about equity.
All right, sounds good.
Somebody has to mention it, because otherwise, 10 years from now, somebody's gonna dig this video up on YouTube and be like, "Oh my God, like these guys."
Yeah, white guys with glasses saving the world. Yep.
So Patrick, take your contacts out next week and wear glasses with the rest of us.
All right. Have a good one.
Okay. I hope you all have a good week.
Thank you.
You too.
Take care.
Take care.